So good afternoon. My name is Luke Dembosky, and I'll be your moderator. And before I introduce the panel, which is on critical services and infrastructure protecting vital elements of modern society, I'll give a little background to set the stage. But we have an incredible panel with us. I'll introduce them alphabetically, starting to my immediate right. We actually are seated alphabetically, which makes it easy for all of us. Rich Baich is the Chief Information Security Officer at Wells Fargo. He's been the CISO for Wells Fargo since July of 2012, previously worked at Deloitte and Touche, where he led the global cyber threat and vulnerability management practice. Prior to Deloitte, he worked extensively in executive security positions within the public and private sectors, including at PricewaterhouseCoopers, ChoicePoint, and the FBI. To Rich's right is Andy Bochman, who is the Senior Cyber and Energy Security Strategist at Idaho National Lab. Andy advises on topics at the intersection of grid modernization and cybersecurity, as well as cyber governance. He has particular expertise with DoD and energy sectors. Previously, as a founder of Bochman Advisors LLC, Andy's mission was to increase security awareness in utilities and in the federal and state organizations that regulate them. Andy has worked for a range of corporations over the years, including IBM. To Andy's right is Jamil Farshchi, who is the Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer of the Home Depot. Jamil was hired as Home Depot's first CISO in April of 2015. Prior to Home Depot, he served as CISO for Time Warner and Vice President Global Information Security Officer for Visa. Before that, from 2001 to 2006, worked for NASA, and then first as an auditor and then as a Deputy Chief Information Assurance Officer. To Jamil's right is Lior Frenkel, who's the CEO and co-founder of Waterfall Security Solutions based in Israel. So he gets the distinction of being our panelist that's traveled the farthest. Lior is, Waterfall, by way of background, is a leading provider of unidirectional security gateways and, quote, stronger than firewalls, perimeter security solution for industrial control networks and critical infrastructure. Waterfall's products have been deployed in homeland security agencies and critical national infrastructures in North America, Europe, and Israel. Lior's experience includes research, design, development of mission-critical systems, national-level cybersecurity technologies, and enterprise-level systems. And finally, but certainly not least, to the far right from where I'm sitting is Tom Patterson, Vice President and General Manager of Unisys Global Security Solutions. And I believe there's been a title upgrade there to Chief Trust Officer for Unisys, which is good to hear. Unisys, of course, is an American global security solutions company based in Blue Bell, Pennsylvania. Tom's team provides both advanced technical teams necessary to stop threats and the strategic board and executive advisory services necessary to prevent them. Tom has served as the Chief Security Officer and a partner at Deloitte, Chief E-commerce Strategist at IBM, and has also founded a tech startup. So it's quite a panel. Again, my name is Luke Dembosky. Most recently, before my current position, I was the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for National Security, heading a portfolio over national security cyber threats at the Department of Justice. Before that, headed the litigation program at the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section at the Justice Department. Spent a while as DOJ's attaché at Embassy Moscow in Russia for justice, and then was a prosecutor specializing in cyber crimes for many years before that. Currently a partner in the cybersecurity and data privacy practice at the law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton. So just to set the stage for our discussion, we come to a point where we have experts of this type here, where really the rubber meets the road in terms of the virtual world having kinetic effects in our everyday lives, and not just the loss of our identities, the loss of our trade secrets and information, but actual threat of physical destruction. This is actually where cyber reaches the life and death point, at least as a potential. As many of you have read in the news, on December 23rd in western Ukraine, there was a very well coordinated attack on the power grid there, on at least 3 different power stations and many substations beyond that. More than 230,000 people were without power. The way that it was carried out was quite simple at the inception. The outside experts are reporting that it was a spear phishing campaign that infected those systems, and that's quite a routine thing that we in the cyber business see as a way in. But once the malware took hold, it gave remote access to a coordinated set of attackers who then turned on breakers to disable the power system across dozens and dozens of stations and substations. They also then took the even more insidious step, or equally insidious step, of deleting all of the backup systems to make sure that there was a lasting impact on the company and the ability to provide critical services in western Ukraine. Of course, we've also recently read about the Department of Justice's indictment of an Iranian hacker charged with gaining access to the sluice gate controls at the Bochman Dam in Rye, New York. No disaster or kinetic effect there, but certainly it crossed people's mind that if that hadn't been disconnected for maintenance reasons, perhaps something more serious would have happened. Against all of that backdrop, at least for what I've seen in my 14 years working cyber cases at Justice, is a progression toward an increasing number of destructive attacks. I think we started to see early iterations of destructive attacks with denial of service attacks carried out by hacktivist groups and others. There were then extortion schemes. We then saw in 2012 something that was, I would call it the canary in the coal mine, but it was more like a much more significant event than that, which was a wiper that went across Saudi Aramco's systems in 2012, destroyed in excess of 30,000 systems. And then, of course, one of the first calls that I received in my last role, I should say, with the Justice Department was from Sony, with a wiper crawling and affecting thousands of systems carried out allegedly by North Korea. And so this rise in destructive attacks, with indications, especially recently, of efforts to cause effects that go beyond the immediate company or target and have ramifications for health and safety on a broader scale, is a very troubling trend. So I wanted to ask each of the panelists to make a few minutes of introductory remarks, and then we'll go through some Q&A that I moderate, and I'm going to leave a good 15 or 20 minutes for questions for all of you. So I'm going to start first on the far end, if I can, and work my way back here. I'll ask Tom Patterson to lead off with brief opening remarks.
Well, thanks, Luke, and it's great to see so many of you chose this topic for your luncheon. I think it's a great program that's been put on so far today, and hopefully we can keep our end up. The first question I always get, especially when my new title is announced, is what is a Chief Trust Officer? And it's I believe, part of a new wave of trends that understand that security is more than cyber security, and our risks are more than computer risks, that everything does have a kinetic effect in this day and age. So the Chief Trust Officer role coordinates cyber, physical security, our Chief Privacy Officer reports in, and our governance people all report in. And we try and engender trust by working more holistically, and we communicate that by being as transparent as possible and being an advocate for the community, which is how I justify taking a day off to come here today and talk to you all. I'm a big, lifelong proponent of critical infrastructure protection. It is why I joined Unisys, because they've got the reach and the customers around the world that produce and account for most or a lot of the critical infrastructure of the world. CIP is an unfair fight. I've seen it firsthand. I've helped governments, I've helped companies, and if it's cybercrime, it could be a criminal versus a company. So the company's on the hook to try and handle that. But when you have critical infrastructure, it's often you're being attacked, not for you, who you are, but for the cascade effect of what sector you're in and what you could do if you went down and they went down to the overall economy that you're part of. And that changes the dynamics. It makes more money and more talent and more skills and more tough attacks possible and get aimed at one individual company. And so if a company treats it as cyber crime, say, oh, well, we'll just pay the ransom, who cares? That could be absolutely the wrong move. So there are, in over 100 countries now, there are countrywide critical infrastructure protection programs where the country tries to marshal its companies to defend themselves better in the best interests of that overall country. The US has one. Like I said, there's over 100 programs around the world. My point of view is that there's a larger way to look at this, a new lens to look at this through that I think might deliver a new set of answers and a new set of solutions for us. And that is looking at it through a single global lens of the civilized planets, the civilized societies' critical infrastructure. In many cases, infrastructure from one country is interconnected intimately to the infrastructure of neighboring countries, in many cases, global infrastructure. So an attack here can, in fact, have an attack that cascades around the world to no one's benefit. And we haven't looked as a society at trying to solve that problem from a global perspective. So I've helped work with the ICS CERT and the East-West Institute to try and pull together industrial control systems protection experts from around the world and critical infrastructure experts from around the world, from all these countries, to get together into a forum to try and re-examine some of the old issues that we've looked at from a lens of our country and try and look at it now from a lens of an overall civilized society, a civilized planet. I do think we're going to come up, and we're already starting to come up, with some new answers that I think will benefit everybody. The number one issue that we see when we're out in the field, I talk to a lot of CEOs, and first I have to explain to them that they are part of critical infrastructure. It actually relates to you and to what you do. But second, I need to try and get them to think of a fresh approach. Most security people and most companies were built up over the past decades and decades and decades. I mean, Unisys is 15 decades old. It takes a fresh approach. What worked before, when all of your your networks were in one building, was to build walls around that building. And so the mentality was, let's build bigger, tougher walls, or stronger walls, don't let anything in and out. But since we've changed the way the world operates, and now you have suppliers that have to be integrated into your networks, and you have workers that want to work from the coffee shop, and they want to use their own home phones. You've got this new mentality that you have out there, and approaching it with the same old solutions is a failed prospect. So the number one message we try and get through at the boardrooms and the C-level executives of the critical infrastructure companies is to take a fresh approach to examining your security and understand that we're talking about more than your bottom line. It used to be a cyber attack was the worst thing it would do is create the blue screen of death. You all remember the old IBM days. Now you can just create death. And that matters. It matters beyond the bottom lines. And that's why I think a lot of people in the industry, in the security industry, in the government industry, and now hopefully from a global perspective, are working together to try and pull together all the resources in this fresh approach. And now that Rachel has given me the stink eye, I will tell you that I spend a lot of time in threat briefings here in Washington. I hear almost every bad thing that's going on anywhere in the world. And I then spend a lot of time with companies and I see their level of preparedness. I will just leave you with one word that sometimes surprises people. That is, I'm very optimistic for the civilized world and for the critical infrastructure space. There is a lot of good things that are going on. I spend a lot of my time matchmaking the good with the need. And again, even knowing the threats that I see, I am very optimistic about our future. It hasn't happened yet on a major scale. It will. There's plenty of bad people that want to do harm to the civilized world, and many of them don't have access to ICBMs. So the easiest thing that they've got access to that can hurt is a cyber attack on critical infrastructure. So I hope we are all getting prepared.
Thank you, Tom, and we're definitely going to delve into the reasons for your optimism. I'm very curious to hear where you see the positives and where we can go in the right direction here. Lior, you're up next.
Thank you. Well, I'll take one note from Tom and which you talk about the unfair or asymmetric type of situation that cyber attacks provide, and I want to focus on that and make it a bit more actual. The reason it's unfair to the benefit of the attacker is in most cases critical infrastructure or industrial facilities protect their main physical asset, their production line, their offshore platform, their turbines, with technology, with security technology that just doesn't manifest a barrier for an attack. For an example, today there's a marketplace for attacks. You can just go out to the marketplace and buy a Trojan horse, or even buy a service that will use that attack and actually run it for you. You don't even need to know the technology, you just need to pay them. And in real life today, the cost of buying a successful attack that penetrates, for example, a power plant network into the turbine. Okay, the cost of that attack that passes through the firewall that protects, that connects between the control network and the internet is anywhere between 5 to 30K. And the attack will take 1 week, 3 weeks to prepare and launch. So you have a $2 billion power plant that's protected with something that will cost to break. It's not even a fraction. I don't know what's 5K from 2 billion. It's crazy. So it's not that it's not unfair or asymmetric inherently. It's like that today because we use the wrong barriers. We use the wrong methods to protect, and so the bad guys, they have a really easy way to do that. And as Tom said, they don't need to use ICBMs or get physically into the facility. They can just do it so easily and so cheaply from the outside. We at Waterfall we work with customers, mainly critical infrastructure, but also industrial site and manufacturing, and so worldwide, and we do see that things are getting better in this regards. We are in the market for almost a decade, and when we started, people would say, "What are you talking about? There's no problem, there's no risk, everything is good. We're working like this for years, and we're happy." And in the last few years, maybe 3 years or so, this conception we see a big shift in this conception, not enough and not everywhere. If you're curious, so Asia is becoming much more aware faster than everywhere we see. U.S. is in a relatively good position, and again, from our perspective, and most of Europe is getting there, but it's not there yet. But that said, the vector is good, and the governments and customers got to the understanding that what they currently use, which was adopted from IT style of protection, where you protect a virtual asset, where here you protect a physical asset. Those technologies won't save you when things happen, and they are seeking out new technologies and technologies that actually fit this type of environment, and things are getting there. Not fast enough, but it is what it is. Thank you.
So Jamil, DHS may not refer to the Home Depot as a critical services or infrastructure company
I think we're pretty critical.
till something breaks in our house or we have a foot of snow in our driveway, and then it's pretty critical. But in all seriousness, retail, of course, has been one of the most heavily targeted, battle-hardened industries, understanding that there are retailers and then there are retailers. Being a retailer at the top of the food chain, what issues are you seeing now? And our goal ultimately, as we engage you in our discussion, I think, is to see what lessons can be applied from retail to other sectors, including especially critical infrastructure sectors.
Yeah, I think we have some other questions. We can probably dive in more deeply on that. So we are not critical infrastructure, that's for sure. But I've worked for a variety of organizations, be it NASA, Los Alamos, Visa in the financial services sector, Time Warner, and so forth. And so I have a perspective of the broad security ecosystem. And at the end of the day, we all face roughly the same types of threats, the same types of actors. The only difference really between critical infrastructure and otherwise is the impact that we can potentially face if a breach does occur. So instead of it just potentially being credit cards or PII, as we heard earlier from Tom, it could be life or death situations. Let me give you a high-level overview of at least the way I view the broader ecosystem right now. I think we face what's called the problem of one. These guys both mentioned this asymmetry. But as defenders, we have to defend against every possible permutation of attack, millions a day. For the attackers to be successful, they merely need to get one through. Now, we do our best to do defense in depth and so forth, but if a phishing email can cause the level of damage that it can to be able to get just within your environment, whether it be stealing an identity, forcing an organization accidentally to send over money fraudulently to another organization, or whatever it may be, it just takes one. And so it puts us necessarily on the defensive, and it makes it really difficult for us to be able to succeed in this environment. What makes it worse, though, is that our attack surfaces continue to expand. Businesses are fundamentally underpinned by technology in today's day and age. Every acquisition, every new application we bring to bear, every new cloud service we decide to adopt, those all make our job as defenders considerably more difficult because it continues to add complexity, additional assets that we have to protect, and a lot of uniqueness in terms of those different environments. So that makes it even more difficult for us. The next one is the asset value. So back in the day, you might have a few records that are digitized, and so if you get them compromised, whatever, the scope of the impact is fairly minimalistic. But today, virtually everything is digital. The level of and value of those electronic assets are profound. And so what that does is that it further incents the attackers, and it causes us to be even more on our heels because we're trying to defend against someone who's highly incented to be able to compromise our environments, while we still are, for the most part, dealing with the same types of tools and technologies and these legacy infrastructures that we've had to deal with and protect in the past. And then you've got the arms race. So the attackers aren't slowing down. In fact, they continue to iterate and they continue to develop new types of innovative malware and so forth to be able to penetrate our environments in such a way that many times we can't even identify them. And so they continue to up their game. And even though we do our best to be able to continue to advance technologies and so forth, and his company over here is doing the same thing to help us in this space, it's extremely difficult. Now, if you combine all those things, all those variables I just discussed, you would conclude that, hey, look, for every organization, let's just lock it down to the nth degree. The problem with that is that there's no purpose for a security organization if there's no business to actually protect. And that's sort of the balance that we have to work in security, is trying to find a way to be able to manage that risk in an acceptable manner, such that we're able to defend the majority of those types of attacks, at least the catastrophic ones, while at the same time allowing the business to actually compete and be successful and make it as frictionless as possible for the broader environment. So it's a very challenging ecosystem that we work within, and I don't know that there's necessarily a silver bullet. Whether it's technology or so forth, you always hear about these great new things that are coming out. But in my experience, whether it's in any of the industries I've worked in, there is no silver bullet. So it takes time. We have to overcome a lot of these legacy issues that we've had to deal with in the past. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're in critical infrastructure or you're in retail. the impacts could be dramatic. I mean, if you look at, for example, the major spike in ransomware as of late, I mean, the key focus there is, hey, we've got some ransomware, it's going to lock down some files, and we'll pay them off, or maybe we won't. And as a result of that, we'll be able to continue our operations. But think about this: when for typical breaches in the retail sector, they focus on your point of sale devices, and their goal traditionally has been to be able to get as much card data as they possibly can, so they can go resell it on the market. But think about a situation where instead of actually trying to get that card data, they ransomware all of our POS systems and simply don't let them to operate for any amount of time. I mean, for a $90 billion company like Home Depot, just a single day is monumental in terms of impact for, at least for our business. Sure, people could maybe go shop somewhere else in the meantime, but it could potentially be catastrophic for us. So these are the types of things that we think about, but you have to view it through the lens of those other 5 criteria that I just described, because we can't just put in every single control and expect our business or even our broader economy to be able to be meaningfully competitive in the global landscape.
Thank you, Jamil. Andy?
Hello. Luke, thanks for bringing me on the panel, and hi, folks. Appreciate your interest in this topic. I have a son who works for Spotify, and you could probably make the case that there's a substantial cohort of our population that thinks that online streaming music is critical infrastructure, and they could not live a day without it either. So it's all in the eye of the beholder, but from the government's point of view, it's not. There's a prioritization and an interdependency that cascades down from the most important things to the somewhat less important things, all the way down to things that don't fall inside that categorization. But man, the DHS labels a lot of things critical infrastructure. I'm just going to hit a couple points in this intro, which is, for me, I'm in the Idaho National Lab. You heard Michelle Hathaway refer to it this morning if you were there when she was asked a question about SCADA. And I don't want to do acronyms and terminology, but SCADA and ICS, Industrial Control Systems, are sort of the 2 of the buzzwords that get you into that space. And not all critical infrastructure is dependent on control systems. Certainly wells and financial, and to a certain extent communications, is not as dependent on control systems. But the minute you get beyond those 2, you get into just, I think industrial covers it nicely, and that's things like electricity and oil and natural gas and water and wastewater and transportation and heavy manufacturing and chemicals, to name a few. All of them use equipment from the same suppliers in different configurations, but in a sense, it's their dependency on control systems that define the greater part, or the far greater part, of their security challenge. You also heard addressed this morning the fact that that critical infrastructure is to a lion's share owned by civilian population, civilian companies, not the federal government. It always is posed as a negative, but maybe it's a positive. Leave you with that. But anyway, so critical infrastructure is owned and operated primarily by civilian companies. It's largely made out of control systems. Now, a couple things about control systems for people that haven't lived and breathed them. They are inherently, by design, and this is true for IT systems up until relatively recently too, control systems even more so are by design not secure. Because only in the past, only Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts were ever going to touch them, and could only get to them. And it's been the desire to achieve efficiencies and situational awareness and other business benefits that's led. I'll stick primarily with electricity. That's my home turf, but everything can be extrapolated to all the other industrial sectors. It's led people to greatly interconnect these systems as part of modernizing the grid, which you could argue needed modernization. But all of these things are inherently insecure by design. That means that the security person's job is much harder, because everything has to be secured through process, through policy, and through bolt-on security, which is usually highly suboptimal. On a positive note, I wouldn't quite call it optimism, but I'll say, on a positive note, to break up the monotony of the negativity, there's a fair amount of diversity in the control system world that you don't see in IT. And to a certain extent, that raises the bar on attackers who have to do a lot more homework to have an understanding of the configurations and the systems, the safety systems that they have to circumvent in order to create an effect that they're trying to create. So there is some diversity there that helps, but obviously doesn't save the day, didn't save the day in the case of Ukraine. The people who are expert in securing these systems are so few, it's not funny. I'm not sure where to draw the cutoff. I'm thinking of doing a census to find out exactly or pretty much how many there are. But ICS security professionals are a rare breed indeed. I would definitely wager there's fewer than 1,000 of them in the world, and it may be closer to 500, but let's see, we'll see what the census produces. But everybody is trying to find them. All of the companies by types need more of them, or they're trying to grow them, and they're all struggling. And these are the things, we have a marketplace that could suitably, gainfully employ tens of thousands of these folks if they existed, but they don't. So that's an issue. Last point, I'll swing back around to the origins of where my talking points come from. You haven't shown me the thing yet, right? Okay, so, so not many people know this. I didn't know it until I joined the lab a couple years ago, but one of the centers of nuclear energy research, not weapons like Los Alamos, but nuclear energy research was Idaho National Lab. In part because there's a couple of reasons, but it's probably because it's isolated. INL also stands for Isolated National Lab, not just Idaho National Lab. I had never been to Idaho before either, too. All right? So imagine you're at the forefront of nuclear energy research and you're building the nation's or the world's some of the first reactors. You would want to, I'm positing that you would want to monitor and manage these systems from a somewhat comfortable distance, right? But control systems don't exist yet, or at least in the form that we think of them now. So in parallel with the development of nuclear energy, the control systems theory, research, understanding, best practices developed in Idaho side by side. Granted, they're all insecure up until we started to think about security, and Clifford Stahl wrote The Cuckoo's Egg, and we thought, oh, these systems are potential targets too, aren't they? So that's sort of the short and confusing way of describing why this little unknown place that you've never been to is actually the center of the universe for control systems security knowledge, and why so many parts of government and industry are gravitating to it. The last thing I'll say is, and so there's a big cluster of these people that have expert control system security and resilience knowledge there, which again is, it wouldn't make sense if you didn't know the origin story. We're launching an initiative to build the workforce, not just for ourselves, but for all of the stakeholders in this great enterprise of critical infrastructure security, and we'll try to feed you some more information on that as it gets underway. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Rich, Wells Fargo and other major financial institutions really are the epitome of trying to be a balance between having a massive consumer and customer interface on one side, yet being a critical infrastructure company at the core of the national interest on the other. How do you strike that balance, and we're going to get into also what lessons the financial sector has learned that could apply in the industrial control system environment, but what are the things on your mind these days?
Well, great. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to the audience. Just to kind of level set so you can understand kind of where my views are coming from today. So I've been in this industry for a very long time, pretty much my entire adult life. So I've done this as a vendor, right? So Network Associates, McAfee. I've done this in the consulting world, Deloitte, PwC. It's my second time as a CISO. And then also I'm a retired naval cryptologist and information warfare officer. So I'll try to use all that different experience as I talk with you today about this topic. So first and foremost, when we talk about the critical infrastructure, it's kind of ironic to me. After 9/11, I was assigned as a special assistant to deputy director up at the FBI in the National Infrastructure Protection Center. There's a lot of words there. And the whole idea behind that is what is our critical infrastructure, right? There had been a office in the White House stood up by it, and we began to try to talk about what is our critical infrastructure. It's very difficult to defend something you don't have an inventory of, right? And understand how that inventory works together. So as far as optimism, I'm very optimistic in our capabilities. I would say to take us to the level of maturation that we want to get to from a critical infrastructure standpoint, we've got to understand not only what is the critical infrastructure, as you mentioned, DHS calls a lot of different things, but the interconnectivity, because the interconnectivity is where the real risk is at. The adversaries, the bad actors, the nation states, whatever APTs, whatever levels you're going to do, they're not these complex hacking techniques. These are very simple things. These are basically exploiting a known vulnerability, failure to patch, the basic hygiene that's associated with good IT management, regardless if you're in a industrial control system, whether that you're in a financial system, whether that you're in a dam operations. If it has internet connectivity and it's on a backbone of basically a internet or internet facing, you have the capability. So when you think about that and you think about what America is built on, and most countries are built on, it's the small to medium businesses, right? So here we have this national critical infrastructure, but we have a tremendous supply chain that fills it. And that's also a big risk, because even if you secure the critical infrastructure, you have to be able to secure the supply chain. Doing the basics is really most important. When you look at all the breaches that occur, most of them are a result of a failure to do what I like to call basic hygiene. So, whether that's your third party, whether that's your vendor producing poor code, whether that you're an organization failing to utilize firewalls or top-grade incident response type of techniques, all those things are things that we expect to be commonplace today. Just as we all expect most of the time that you're locking your doors on your cars in a bad neighborhood, or your doors at night and different things like that, regardless of the environment that you live in. So keep in mind that oftentimes a lot of this is a result of not doing the basics very well. The third thing about the critical infrastructure is the resiliency, right? Because it's not a matter of if. We shared several examples Luke did as far as where our critical infrastructure has been impacted, but what is our ability to respond in a timely fashion, isolate, and continue moving forward? An adversary can pretty much probably get into any environment that they truly desire to get into, but they can't necessarily dictate how an organization or a government responds. So, organizations need to focus on the response mechanism just as much as the preventive, because the response oftentimes is the thing that actually ensures the livelihood of the organization. And keep in mind, from the government standpoint, as well as the private and public industry, this is difficult. I can't remember, one of the panelists had said this before, but the bad guys only have to be good once. We got to be good 24/7, 365 days a year. And sometimes you make an honest mistake, and sometimes that mistake is exploited, and you find yourself fallen victim. So when you look at all these different things in the critical infrastructure, the dependencies is what's key. Most organizations today, as far as how the entire IT infrastructure works, is loosely defined, if even known. And then what are the dependencies? What happens if this channel went down? What happens if this ISP went down? What happens if you had some BGP rerouting going on, you didn't even know where your traffic was going to? Are you monitoring for that? And those are different levels of maturation and investments that organizations and our government bodies invest in and have those capabilities. But ultimately, when you peel back, again, Luke, some of your examples, you've got things going on like, obviously, cybercrime. You've got distributed denial of service. You've got destruction of data. And all those types of things cause people to potentially lose confidence, right? But ultimately, when you really think about what this is doing, it's causing people to stop. It's causing disruptions. It's causing investments. It's causing money. It's a disruption to our entire financial system, all the way down to the end users, to our tax dollars and how they're being used. Some might say that it's actually a strategy, right, to impact those countries that have mature technologies in place. There are some countries today that are developing their networks to be isolated from the actual internet in a time of emergency because of all of our dependencies to the public internet. So when you think about this today, think about it from a standpoint of when 9/11 occurred and those planes flew into that building, nobody held the building managers responsible for their planes. They just believed that there was protection. Cyber, when you have a nation state attacking a company who already has an existing cyber program, you know, should they be sued? When does the government play a larger role if a nation state, an enemy, actually attacks? So we've got to get our heads around what's an act of war, what's strategic deterrence, all these different things that to really help our critical infrastructure figure out what are the right measures and the actions to take as we go to do this. And we'll obviously talk more about these potential things and share some more from a financial industry standpoint as we get further into the panel.
Thank you, Rich. So I'd like to turn briefly now, and I'm going to ask Lior to comment on this in a second, but what is the state of preparation? What's the state of play? And understanding it may be different in the United States versus other countries. Are many critical infrastructure companies prepared? If not, what is their level of urgency or sense of urgency to be prepared? Lior, could you say a word about that?
So we said we are optimistic, right?
Not everybody said that.
Well, not everybody. Well, it's relatively hard to, you know, to say the state like globally of preparation, but in most cases it's relatively at the start, and also it really differs between countries. Somebody said here previously that, you know, most of critical infrastructure is private. That's correct, but in the U.S., in Israel, or in many Asian countries, in many Eastern European countries, most of the infrastructure is government or government owned, and the good thing of that in this regard is that they have much more direct and effective control on what goes on there. So when a government in a country that controls, I don't know, 80% of the critical infrastructure, when they decide to run a program, the program runs. While here and in other countries where your infrastructure is mainly private, the ability of the government to force these infrastructures to adopt adequate cyber programs and all the cost and liability and everything that is involved is really hard. So what we do see is that countries that their infrastructure is mostly government owned, in those types of countries there are more countries which are prepared better than those where the infrastructure is mainly a private sector. And as Andy said, there are. It's not clear which is better. This is just an observation. I want to touch a bit of a different issue that was raised here, which is related. There are infrastructures that are perceived as too big and too complex to be really attacked, or to be attacked in a way that harms the whole system. And the U.S. power grid is one of those. And what we think is that this was correct, maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, when although everybody started to connect their infrastructure to the internet and to the business sides and everything, and the interconnectivity became really, really big. But then you say, okay, each plant is different, each customer, each infrastructure uses different vendors and different configuration, everything, so you can't really launch a simultaneous attack. That was correct then, but today, with cloud services, industrial cloud services, with vendors remotely monitoring their systems at the customers, or namely remotely monitoring their turbines or their systems on the power grid and on substations. This remote monitoring services, which are really good and cost effective and provide a lot of good operational and business values, interconnect between large parts of the power grid to really big hubs that touches each and every one of those parts in the same way. Okay, again, without giving out names or anything, but if you have an industrial vendor which is used widely by the power grid and has 30% of the market, and they have a control center that monitors all of their equipment in their customers, this means that I don't need to design and attack a specific different attack on each and every one of those sites anymore. I just need one attack on the monitoring center. And through that, I have access, direct access, the same access to, let's say, 30% of the power grid. And this now becomes an alarming because we took all of that really good complexity and flattened it out. And now theoretically, with 3 or 4 or 5 classes of attacks, you have access to a big portion of your power grid. So again, I'm optimistic, but
Doesn't sound like it.
So
no, but the challenge is big, and the interconnectivity, as people here said before, the connectivity and interconnectivity on dependencies are the main problem, and we can solve it. It will just take some more time.
So I think both Tom and Andy wanted to add on to that. If I could ask you both to be just concise about it. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, so 10 years ago, I wrote a book that looked at security in 40 different countries in the world, and we looked at most of the sectors. And so 10 years ago, we rated the energy sector being the most prepared for a critical infrastructure attack. That was through a lot of interviews with companies all over the world. I would say the past 10 years of my work bears that out. And while you see, there's definitely some great work in the financial sector, great work in healthcare and the life sciences side with some great people. The common denominator that I've found over the last decade for who is the better prepared organization or sector is that they've realized that this is not an IT issue. They've elevated this to the board. When the board is educated and informed and passionate about these issues, change happens in a good way. And if it stays an IT issue, it's still back to, this is a budget thing, you haven't shown me, how do you assure bad things are going to happen, what's the ROI? But when it becomes a board issue, which it has in almost every case of major energy companies around the world, you do see this better preparedness and better change.
Andy?
Yes. Because Lior's sentiment was such a downer for me, I wanted to share something slightly more upbeat. And so the slightly more upbeat thing is a trend, and we can go to energy sector or any other critical infrastructure sector. It's to, I believe, include financial services, but I don't want to speak about something I'm not expert in. The origin of the position of head security dude or woman, and this is going to be short, right? Short. Is that it was a person who was in the IT department in a lot of companies, especially critical infrastructure. IT is a backwater. It's a support service. It's not the power center of the company. It's just there to provide basic business services in the past. And so your security person, who is 1, 2, or 3 levels down from the CIO or the IT VP or the director of IT, they came out of a network admin or similar type of techie job. As security became something of more of a material concern, more strategic concern, that person was extremely ill-equipped in a lot of ways to play the role the company needed them to play. There's some intermediate steps here, but in the interest of brevity, I'll just say, we talked about, security people talk about indicators of compromise. There's an indicator of organizational maturity, and Luke and I touched on this in our prep talk, which is in the electric sector, and from what I'm hearing from the retail sector and maybe Unisys too, increasingly a position is being created that didn't exist before. And it is no small feat to create a brand new executive position in a large company.
Yeah.
And that position is called generally Chief Security Officer or Chief Information Security Officer, CISO. In the past, people even low down on the totem pole were called that as a shorthand, but it was a fake term because the person wasn't really a chief and they weren't an officer. Everybody just knew to call them their CISO. But increasingly, in the electric utilities that I come in contact with, and increasingly means this is not a stampede. I don't mean to overrepresent. But it's less rare, and I'm finding more companies are starting to create this position and staff it with somebody with a fair mix of technical and business acumen so that the board and the other C-suiters can understand the language that they're speaking. And if you see that in a company you're looking at from a security perspective, it's not a panacea, it doesn't solve all problems, but it means the company's awake. It's awake, it's responded to the challenge. Lord knows they've had enough reason to respond, but still, some's taken a while. If you look for that very senior chief security position person positioned up in the same organizational cul-de-sac as the other people that make the decisions at that company, that's a good indicator.
So I want to turn to Rich and Jamil, but hearing you, Andy, it sounds like we should not be waiting for perfect. We should be starting to tackle things and get to a good level of security. So my question in terms of critical infrastructure is, how do we prioritize and take disaster off the table? How do we get to a point where we can suffer a loss of PII, we can suffer a temporary shutdown? I guess it's a question of resilience and avoiding a disaster. How do we quickly get to that point? I'm wondering your thoughts on this from the financial sector perspective, Rich.
Sure, I like to, you're talking about a disaster, and a disaster, as you know, is something that's unpredictable, right? So, train the way you fight. It goes back to what I was talking about. Make sure you're practicing how to deal with an incident all the way through the organization, right? Cyber is just not a cybersecurity incident response. It's a whole team, the entire organization. So what I've seen is organizations are expanding it outside and practicing it, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, getting all the way up to the CEO involved in it. In the financial sector, we have a group called the Financial Services Coordinating Sector, and we sponsor a lot of these events, and we actually have one coming up where we're requesting CEOs to actually be part of the exercise itself, so taking it up to that level. But to me, the most important thing is we can hypothetically come up with 1,000 different ways that a disaster can occur. The trick is spending your money and practicing good risk management around the probability of occurrence. The probability of occurrence and understanding that, I really think, defines an organization's ability and preparedness for an issue. And what I mean by that is oftentimes an organization gets hit by something, an event, an incident, or a disaster, and we should learn from it, right? And then make that a priority in where we're spending our money to do risk management. So to me, the best way is trying to understand and prioritize the disasters, and then ensuring you've got the appropriate controls in those. Not that we'll ever be prepared for everything, because that's impossible in the world of cyber, but chasing the ones that are most prevalent, that our other organizations are falling to, because the bad guys, they're lazy. They just want to keep using the same technique over and over again if you let them.
Jamil, I want to turn to you next and ask you to draw not only on your Home Depot experience, but all of your experience at a high level working on these issues, and ask you what sort of strategies and intangibles in your mind are the key difference makers for resilience? Whether retail or another sector, what are the strategies that position or pre-position a business to bounce back from a major cyber incident?
I think the first one is, and I just call it preparing to fail. So we need to be sure across the organization, just as Rich said, that everyone is engaged, that because it's not just a cyber incident. When you have a breach similar to one anywhere, Home Depot or otherwise, it's going to pull in a variety of different individuals, from whether it's legal or HR, whomever. And you need to be able to have that mentality, understand what the chain of command is going to be, who's going to be the incident commander, and have it all scripted out. You can't predict every single possible scenario, but what you can do is understand what who needs to be involved in the different types of things. I think the other thing that's important is again, the risk management piece. I'm going to echo exactly what I said on this one. You need to be able to have that visibility up to the board level in terms of what specifically are the key risks, what risks are you accepting, and which ones we're not willing to put into play. And these things happen on a regular basis. I mean, I can't tell you how many times per week I get requested to allow this to happen or allow that to happen, and I think to myself, holy smokes, I mean, the amount of risk here is insurmountable. But my job at the end of the day isn't to lock down every single potential vector across the organization. It's to be an advisor to the business. I need to be able to make sure that they understand what the risks are, what the impacts may be, and what our risk treatment plans should be as a result of it. And if they buy off on the risk, more power to them. I think that's our job from a security perspective. I think one of the other key things that's been going on, at least in the retail sector, that's really improved as of late, is our information sharing. Organizations have made, because of the breaches, they've made significant investments in technology and so forth, people and staffing. But one of the things that we hadn't had previously was a meaningful ISAC, a meaningful mechanism to be able to communicate across the different organizations, know what kind of threats they were seeing, the various types of attacks, the technologies that they were putting in place. And I think we've done a really good job as of late in terms of building in that broader ecosystem to make us all more intelligent and be better partners amongst each other. And I think I'd be missing out if I failed to call out probably the most important factor in terms of being prepared for these things, and that's the people. And it's one of the most difficult challenges we have in security today is identifying the right people and getting that level of talent. I mean, security is projected to have a 1 million open jobs by, I think, by 2017. So we're at serious negative unemployment rate right now. So even if you get someone, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult. To find really, really good people within that space becomes even more challenging. And so it's about being thoughtful about the specific skill sets you need, outsourcing to certain organizations in the areas that you don't necessarily need to have to be best of the best from a capability perspective, and then building in meaningful mechanisms from a training and development standpoint. So even if you get a junior person that's a tier 1, for example, you can build them up into a very strong contributor going forward. So some of the things that I've done in that space is partner with some of the really strong engineering schools. I mean, in Atlanta, we leverage Georgia Tech extensively. We've put in a lot of these training programs in specific disciplines, whether it's an application security side or the engineering side and so forth. We try to make the environment as conducive to learning and partnering and shadowing other individuals to be able to build those folks up. Because if your strategy is purely to just go out there and bring the best of the best in, at best it's going to take a long time, but at worst you're going to be flailing and be without critical resources as you build out your team. And without those people, I don't care what the breach is or what the situation is, you're not going to be able to respond in a meaningful fashion.
Thank you, Jamil. I think I want to drill down on the workforce point a second with Andy. You mentioned in the past it was really an assumption that it was Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and now we're down to perhaps as few as 500, I think you said, worldwide that really know that. So what is the strategy to change? Is it to go to more of a universal type system, an IP-connected system that would bring in more professionals that might be qualified, but the other side of the equation might be that it would increase the surface area for attack? One of the joys of my last job was being part of the government's response to the OPM breach. And sometimes when nothing works, maybe your best defense is that you're old school and your systems are so different from what a typical attacker will see that there are just inherent challenges in figuring that out, and a number of you touched on that. So what is the strategy, Andy, to go forward and address the workforce challenge?
First of all, let me commend you for using the word joy. We don't use that word very often, but it's a nice change of pace. So Jamil mentioned the oft-cited million cybersecurity expert shortfall. It's either now and or it's coming within a few years. And where are those people going to come from to fill those jobs? Please, when I say other than that number, The next numbers that come out of my mouth are very, they're a wild ass guess. But I think you can infer from what you see, if you're looking, that the percentage of people who are cybersecurity people who have experience, hands-on industrial control systems, PLCs, RTUs, all of the different acronyms, the different, the many different esoteric communications protocols that are in that world, the understanding of the way the safety systems work in their sector, in those different configurations, it's vanishingly small. And so while I can't speak to a national campaign on cyber in general, I think you can look around and see different universities starting to ramp up, adding on to their information technology program, cybersecurity specialties or even majors I'm hearing about now. So you can do that. And grant you, if you do that just from an academic point of view, you still have the school of hard knocks before anyone's going to trust you in real world stuff. You've got to get out there and lay your hands on real equipment and get to production equipment. It's another story. But quick pivot over into the operational technology world. Again, OT is the counterpart to IT in what I've been describing. We're going to try to build, and this is the Idaho lab and a handful of other lab partners and industry and academic partners. We're trying to build up a national level effort to grow a substantial crop of OT security professionals, partly through the university system and potentially leveraging, let's see, NSA has a cohort of around 100 different universities that have information assurance accreditations, injecting some control systems knowledge into those so that those young folks come out of there with at least a beginning understanding. This is a career that they could take that really needs them. And then also mid-career folks that have one half of the puzzle in their head already through direct experience. People that are IT security pros, but that haven't touched operational equipment before, and actually would be dangerous if you put them on it right now. But at least they've got the base of knowledge from the IT security experience that over time and gentle grooming, that they could be a useful asset to a critical infrastructure company on their OT assets. The converse of that is somebody that is an operator, an engineer who's hands-on industrial systems, but's never even thought of cyber before. That person is ready to have some of that knowledge mid-career injected into them, and ultimately, whether it's coming through academia, from one side on cyber, from one side on operations, we hope to grow a substantial group of these folks.
So we just have a couple minutes before we turn to audience questions, so go ahead and have your questions in mind. But Tom, I haven't forgotten that you led off by saying you were optimistic. And some might say you've led with your chin, but why in the world are you optimistic, and how could you possibly become more optimistic as we go forward?
I'd love to answer that question. Let me answer it by answering Andy's comment. First off, Andy said maybe as few as 500. Those are pure ICS security expert people. I don't want to leave the audience with the feeling that there's only 500 smart security folks in the world, because there's really a lot of them. And that million figure encompasses all sorts of things that I believe should be useless and needless in the near future. So the other side of the workforce coin, so again, why am I optimistic if there's this million shortfall? Because the other side of this coin is the security products have to get more intelligent themselves. You have to build more security into the products so they require less and fewer security people to operate. We've gotten into this point where in order to put someone into a group or take someone out or change some status, you need an army of security folks to go through and read all the firewall logs and check all these bits and bytes. That's going away. So my first job when I left the intelligence community and got a real job was for Admiral Bobby Inman, who had set up a shop in the commercial world. And he hired me to be his vice president of transparent security. And he said, I want the strongest security in the world, and I don't want anyone to see it. I don't want anyone to touch it. I just want this stuff to work. And that was the goal. And he was a pretty smart dude, still is a pretty smart dude. And that stuck with me. So I see a lot of newer technology in the security world that doesn't require an army of cyber warriors to just turn it on and make it run. You still need them, we still need to grow them, and we work with universities around the world to turn out people that know this stuff. But again, in terms of a workforce, I'm not that pessimistic. And I think if you look at both sides of that coin, we're definitely growing. But other things that make me optimistic, even knowing all the threats that are out there, one is that board level participation. I spend more time talking to board members now than IT folks around the world in every industry, because they're interested. They're figuring, how do I learn more? How do I get to do this better? They're learning and understanding out at board level that being compliant doesn't mean you're being secure, and that they're both important and you need both, but you can't confuse the two. And so we're seeing changes there. Budgets are not nearly the problem that they used to be in order to do the right things. They do want to avoid that catastrophe. What can we change to actually make us more secure? And there's a whole bevy of later modern technologies, like the old adage of you need to segment your network. So if you break in over here, it doesn't hurt you over here. That got really hard to do with yesterday's technology, but with new technology like microsegmentation and things, it's actually not that hard to do. And so again, I'm optimistic there. And the last thing is the information sharing. I started with the DIB ISAC back in the very early days, and then some of the early days of the FS ISAC. We were a mess back then. We didn't know what was going. We had the ideal, but we didn't have the way to facilitate it. Now, if you look at the FS ISAC, it's a freaking machine. And every other ISAC that I work with, I say, go look at how they did it 10 years ago and follow that path. Look at the National Health ISAC now. It went from juice and cookie parties to a real force because the companies themselves took it over and made it into something that they needed. So absolutely, the good guys have the tools, they have the wherewithal, they have the importance, and the dynamic is changing. The one thing where I argue with my peers a lot is that old concept of the bad guys only have to be right once. I disagree. I think that was the old thinking, that you had to have this perfect thing so no one could get in. But if they got in once, they could destroy you. You have to change your mindset there, and I think a lot of companies are starting to do that, banks and energy companies first among them, and governments. So if they get into this little bit over here. And yeah, it's a problem, and yeah, you've got to deal with it, and yeah, they could do bad things in there. But you break the kill chain. They aren't able to go sideways and lateral, and that allows you to use things like clouds and use things like employees that work in coffee shops. You get a lot of benefits there. So I think technology's there. I think the mindset's there. I think the bad guys are still there and going after us, but I think it's now a fair fight.
So Rich, last word on this subject. By the way, there could be a whole nother seminar on the role of government here. Lior started off mentioning that in China and other parts of the world, governments tend to control these. I don't know what that, that may have a separate consequence for competence questions and who's best prepared to control the systems. So maybe one of our audience members will ask that. But Rich, I saw you writing furiously some notes when Tom was talking and some of the other comments. So I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, Tom, I would say I don't speak for all industries. I represent financial, and all of my peers would disagree with almost everything you said.
I hear that a lot.
Well, we knew it would be lively. All right. Well, does somebody want to take a flyer quickly on the government question? Is the government's role to be, as Tom and some others have suggested, a catalyst by setting up ISACs and ISALs and other industry-driven structures? Where does government get in the way too much, and what should the most effective role of a government under a U.S. structure or a Western structure be? Sir?
Can I phrase that question for you?
Please.
Should I use the microphone?
Yes, if you would. Thanks.
Help you out here. Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm not sure the microphone's on. Hello, thank you for being here. My name is Carl. I work for the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. We are at the crossroads of government for the private sector, law enforcement, the intelligence community, as well as those very critical infrastructure asset owners and operators. What can the NCIC do better for you members of the panel? And because the darts are going to come, I'm going to go over there and take your answer over there. Thank you.
Any takers?
So first off, the fact that you're focused and asking that question, we greatly appreciate it. I think I think you step back before you step forward, and what I mean by that is clearly and simply articulate what you can and what you can't do, because there are certain things under Title 10, Title 50, and different things that you're not allowed to do, nor can different members of the IC community and law enforcement. And from a board of directors standpoint, them understanding that helps dramatically. Second thing you can do is ensure that organizations are prepped in how to utilize you. So as members of the critical infrastructure, we all have sponsoring organizations. In my case, obviously, it's Treasury. So we have an existing RTI in place so that if we ever need government's help, we don't have to wait. Request for technical assistance, RTA, sorry. So I think put your hat on and say, how can you help these members of the critical infrastructure easily get to government, pre-stage it, so that there's less time lost when you're dealing with an incident, worrying about getting the lawyers all on board and who's going to do what. So a little bit just, change what you're doing, think of it from our standpoint, help organizations get those tools that aren't as mature, and I think it'll go a long way. But I applaud what you guys are doing to date. It's just some ideas to look at.
Whoa. Are you guys all NKIC plants?
Lior, I was going to see if you could comment on perhaps how things are working in terms of public-private interaction in Israel or any other markets where Waterfall is operating, where you're helping public-private relationships in this space.
Thank you, and we are also working with NKIC and for a long time now. I think the answer for your original question is almost political. What's the capacity of the government in anything? So, and personally, I think that the government needs to focus and needs, at least the enforcement part of it should be on things which are critical for society as a whole, okay, the country's society, okay, so things that can impact that dramatically needs to be at the control of the government, and they need to be able to run as they do with nation-state attack, with physical attacks, with everything else, with force of nature, and so on. All the rest and again, it's more a philosophical than technical question, but all the rest should be dealt by the open market, by the private sector. And I think that at that level, the government, because of the current state of protection, the current state of technology and so on, I think that the government needs to assist here with education, with providing technologies, with providing best practices, to support the growth of the market and to support the maturity of it, but not to be involved in how it works and how to protect and so on. I don't think it's the right position for them.
Anyone else on this question?
Yeah, if you don't mind, just sort of amplifying Rich's response to Carl from NKIC about first appreciation for anybody that says, how can I help? How can I help? How can my organization help? At the federal level, we do a lot of work at the state level too. And states have resources. Many have fusion centers that were set up for law enforcement or something else, but they're starting to become, and so you can make your international analogs of this too, federal down into provincial and state level and city level too, town and city. But half of the battle is letting the people that might need to take advantage of that service know that you exist and what's your phone number or email address, and meet face to face so you can build trust relationships when times are good. The FBI director said that this morning. Know us before, not just afterwards. And you'll hear that repeated, I think, at every level of government. And the service providing companies, the MSSPs and others, do it as well. They obviously there's financial incentive, but there's an efficacy element as well, which is get to know each other and see what normal business looks like, what normal operations look like, and have some human relationship with each other before the balloon goes up and it's time to parachute in and try to put out fires. So that's the socialization part, I would imagine.
Anybody else in the audience with questions? If you could make your way up to the mic, and while you're doing that, I'm going to ask Rich to comment because I know that he was in Israel recently engaging on these issues. If you could just say a brief word.
Sure. So what I observed over in Israel is potential for a lot of countries to look at. So as you all know, most of our individuals spent time in the military, and there's probably about 140 different cybersecurity startup companies over there. But more so, what the government is doing about it. I mean, they're taking a location in Israel and kind of making it a cyber center for the entire country. They're inviting individuals from all around the world to engage. They're producing services as well as products and helping get those into the mainstream in different countries, different supply chains. So when you look at driving change and you look at that key tone from the top, what I witnessed over in Israel is a very strong tone from the top from cyber, when really cyber is kind of like everyone's job there. So it was an interesting approach.
Sir?
Hi, Mark Peters with MITRE. As we begin to see cyber incidents that have the possibility of creating broad physical consequences for the public, in Ukraine the power went out. Could be other things. People need to be freed from elevators. They need air conditioning, heating, whatever the case may be. Is anybody in the world well prepared to provide an integrated response to both the cyber and physical effects and consequences of such an incident? And if not, what's needed to move us forward as a society?
Tom, could I ask you to take a shot at that one?
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the question. I think it is something that a lot of the leading companies are starting to see. We have clients in the life sciences space that get that right now and that are working feverishly. Nobody's done. There isn't a great answer. I agree with Rich's characterization of the Israeli model. I think that for the last 10 years or so, that's been the model that other sectors have been looking at to try and emulate. So I believe that that's coming. I think we're a few years out before you can make that a reality, but I do work a lot on talking about the convergence of physical and cybersecurity because there are benefits there as well. It's not just that there are risks, but there are benefits. If you track your employees, they drive up through into the parking lot and you match their car, you match their face, you match their gait, and they swipe a card and they get in. Then they sit down at their computer and they start the whole process of identifying again by typing in name 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's dumb, and everybody's starting to realize that's dumb, and they should unite those two. So, but I do think that's a few years out before you see that being useful in the world.
Sir, you get the last question.
Okay, thank you. At one point, you all said that CIP is unfair, and it was alluded to the fact that perhaps CIR could help level the playing field. But another point, resiliency was equated to response, and I think it needs to be more. I think it needs to include anticipation and avoidance, as well as withstanding, mitigation, and response to the effects of adversity, whether natural or man-made, under all circumstances of use. I believe that we need to focus on anticipation and avoidance a lot more than we have in the past. And I have in mind here the need to uncover cascade triggers. My question to you all is, how important are cascade triggers in the work that you do at the practical level?
Did everyone hear the question? It's, if you didn't in the back, it's how important are cascade triggers in the work that we do in terms of critical infrastructure protection. Any takers on that?
What's a cascade trigger in the way you mean it?
A cascade trigger would be something that's lurking around that's going to, when entered, whether by design or accidentally, have some consequential effects that have this nature to them and that are cross-sector oriented. So they're hard to find if you're in your sector with your binders on looking at your own stuff. I take it from the reaction here that cascade triggers is not a subject that you're focusing on at this point.
Sure. So I mean, different terms, right? I would look at that and say that that's good modeling, right? That's good exercise play. That's good understanding of your dependencies across sectors. Ultimately the idea is good risk management is vulnerability times threat times asset value, but the probability of occurrence, to me, is equally or more important than cascading triggers, because in a world that we live in, the amount of risk is truly unacceptable. So, you know, our focus is on defining the probability.
Risk and models are methods to do it, but the cascade triggers, the existence themselves, and knowing what they are, so you can flatten them ahead of time. You don't think that's really, or I agree with models and all that, but is it something we want to put some real effort into? Looking for cascade triggers across sector.
So let's, I see that Rachel's giving us the hook, and she's been very patient. These are great questions, and perhaps we can take some of the questions offline afterwards if the panelists have time. Thank you very much.